Uh, okay. Okay, so good morning. For some of us earlier than usual this morning, so we're getting coffee delivered to the room. People will understand. It's great to see everyone again. It's day 5 of our week sessions. Today, the way we're going to try to deal with the papers in order we're going to deal with them today are agenda paper 8 and agenda paper 8A. Then we'll go to 5D with the communications. We have 3 hours scheduled for this. We need to reserve the time after our break, which is approximately halfway in the session, for external communication. So that should give you a sense, if you're sort of watching the clock and monitoring how you're progressing in terms of comments. We really do need to get agenda papers 8 and 8A out of the way before the break to provide sufficient opportunity to comment on external communications. And so I ask, sort of discipline yourself in such a way. We want to have obviously a robust conversation, but we also need to get through our business today. I wanted to, with that, turn it over to Brett. I think you're going to lead the discussion on agenda paper 8, which is related to coordination, effective date, and implementation support.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, I'll indeed be taking care of this session on behalf of the task force chairs. First of all, I just want to thank all the staff involved in this part of the process. As always, you know, when you're trying to get a number of disparate streams and bring them all together, it is a little bit of hard work that happens behind the scenes to get us to this point. So I really want to thank all the staff and also particularly the task force chairs, who have been a pleasure to work with through the whole process. Including Len, who's been joining all our meetings, you know, because of the close coordination needed between 220 particularly and 600. Now, I don't know, for those of you who are a little bit like me, I can always judge whether or not I'm going to enjoy a presentation based on whether or not the speaker tells a story at the start of the presentation. If there's a story, I know it's going to be good. If there's no story, maybe it's going to be good, but you know, initial indications are not great. So if you are one of those people and you're a little bit like me, then I would just like to point out that I have in fact told a story at the start of the presentation, and therefore you should have high expectations for what is to follow. Now, okay, just trying to coordinate my slides on the 7,000 screens in front of me. Okay, so a couple of things we're going to be talking through today. First of all, just some very general stuff on the coordination between the projects and what's going to happen in Q3. I'll then move on. We'll talk about the effective date, which is obviously the main topic of conversation. And we've reserved a little bit of time at the end just to update you on where we are with implementation support. So first of all, tackling the coordination between the projects. The main activity we're going to be undertaking in Q3 is alignment of the text between the standards. This is an iterative process. It does take a lot of coordination. Every time you think you've got it nailed down, you know, someone changes something in another standard and you have to go back and do the exercise again. But it is a process that we take very seriously. There will be times when we, you know, need to bring the task forces, you know, back to the table to try to work out what we really meant by something. We will try to keep that to a minimum because we aren't expecting the changes to be major between the standards. But we did just want to flag that that's going to be one of the major activities in Q3. It actually won't be over until probably even after the board has finished voting on the standards, because there is always inevitably something that we'll find in that final approval session that you know, maybe just needs to be aligned across the 3 standards. So we'll talk to you about the process for that in September. But I did want to flag that this is going to be a continual and iterative exercise through the next few months. The other thing that we're going to be doing in Q3 is liaison with the ethics board. Obviously, this is a very key relationship for us, and trying to make sure that we're as tightly coordinated as we can is very important to us. I've listed some things in there that we're going to be talking to them about. Obviously, objectivity of the EQR's role and mindset, which particularly affects 220 and that little paragraph we have on biases. But we've also left space for coordination at the level of each individual standard as is needed. So probably true, particularly for QM1, but I never would want to take the other two standards off the table and say we have nothing to talk about, because inevitably, as conversations go on, people raise questions about whether there's a linkage that needs to be made back to the ethics standards, and so we'll keep that going. Next slide, please, Amon. So in terms of the, turning right now to the effective date, there's 4 things we need to talk about. The first one of which is the wording. We'll then just give you a recap of where we stand with the comments on the effective date. We'll then look at the options and also the facility for early adoption. Next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of the effective date paragraphs, we didn't get a whole lot of comments on the effective date paragraphs in 220 and QM2. We did, however, get a few comments on QM1, and I'll let Natalie talk to these, because she's very close to the text in this place. But the wording is in the agenda item, and there's a slide coming up which features it. So Natalie, I hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Brett. So yeah, as Brett mentioned, I think we've heard a couple of comments back on the ED from respondents who were seeking clarity on the meaning of the effective date. So as you may recall, we came to the board in March with some proposed changes to the effective date. I think what we heard is that the board is generally in agreement on what we intend by the meaning of that in terms of the design and implementation of the system. But we did take away from the March discussion that there were some concerns about us adding in the words commenced operation, which is what we presented in March. So the task force gave it some more thought, and we recognize that firms may approach the implementation in a number of ways, and that would be really helpful for us to be able to explain that in the context of explaining what we mean by the effective date. So as you would have seen in the issues paper, we explain some of those approaches. For example, the firms may take a phased approach and slowly adjust to new policies or procedures as they work towards implementing the new system, or they may want to pilot test the new system, or there may be firms that just kind of switch using my words, switch the system on and off, hit the switch. So it really is challenging to explain these different approaches in the standard, and of course, we really want to keep the standard quite simple. So we thought that it would be better to rather explain further the meaning of the effective date and explore some of these different approaches in the basis for conclusions or the other supporting guidance, because we really think it kind of lends itself very well to first-time implementation guidance. The other piece that we thought about here was, there was a suggestion that came up in March, and it came up in the board as well as in the CAG session, that we make it clearer in the description of the effective date when the first evaluation of the system is required to be performed. So you'll see in the agenda item 5A, which is our standard for ISQM1, you'll see that we have actually added in some words there to explain that. And really what we did also think about as well when we were adding in these words is whether it would actually be possible for the firm to do the evaluation in the first year, and what type of information the firm may use. And we thought about this because, of course, as you may have seen through the examples that we explained in agenda item 8B, it takes time for the engagements to really come on board and for them to start being performed under the new standards. So as we explained in the issues paper, agenda item 8, we do think that the firm will have the right information available to them, but it's how they use that information in terms of evaluating the system as it comes into full function that may differ in the first year of implementation. So I'll hand it back to Brett to take us through the questions.
Okay, no worries. Thank you, Natalie. So Armand, if you wouldn't mind just advancing to the slide which has the 3, that's it. Nope, previous one. Perfect. Okay, so these are the effective date paragraphs that we've got in the 3 standards. You will see that there's we've tried to align them as best we can between the three. And Armand, if you just turn to the question slide now. So the question for the board is, do you support the wording of the effective date paragraphs as proposed in that previous slide? Thanks, Tom.
Why don't you pop the wording back up so people could see it? Okay, I'll start taking comments on this. Should we?
Thank you, and hello everyone. I just want to come in to say that I support the wordings, and I want to take the opportunity to just say that I love agenda item 8B, the voiceover on the PPT. Of course, you can choose to read the speaker's note, but with such professionally narrated voiceover, who will choose to read? So well done, Natalie. Thanks.
Thank you. Fernando?
Hello, everyone. I'm also in support of the way the effective date is presented for the three standards. It's just interesting to see the size of the or the extent of the wording for ISQ M1 compared to ISQ M2, and then compared to ISA 220, which in my mind also talks about the complexity of each one of the standards. Thanks.
Thank you, Fernando. Josephine?
Morning, everyone from London. I support the wording. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. Bob Dorff?
Thanks, Tom. Good morning. Yes, very simply, I support the wording as proposed. Thanks.
I see a trend here. I like this trend. Sachika?
Hello, everybody. A very simple support. Thank you.
Guy Martin?
Same here. Support for the text.
Fiona?
Supportive. Thank you.
Sue?
Also supportive, and also very complimentary of the narrated PowerPoint, because I think what that does is illustrate the challenges that that firms will have to face in applying all the different standards. Thank you.
Roger?
Supported. Thank you.
Isabel?
Sorry. Hello, everybody. Supportive. Thank you.
Okay. Kai-Uwe?
Yes, thanks, Tom. Good afternoon from Germany. And I want to confirm the trend, Tom. Support.
I like that. Eric?
Same for me, and compliments on the video as well. I thought it was excellent. Thanks.
Rich?
Support the wording. I do have one comment, I guess, is just, so I see the discussion, or there will be a discussion in the basic conclusion, which I understand. Will there be a FAQ or that video or something put out to help users understand what this all means? I know we don't have application material for the effective date paragraph, so.
Okay. I'll turn it back to Brett on that question that Rich says, but I see full support for the wording right now. And if you haven't spoken, raise your hand. But okay, Brett, I think you have unanimous support for the wording.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. That is very pleasing to hear. Just on the point, Rich, that you were raising, I think the short answer is I think we probably will need to say something in an FAQ or other similar document. It may not go into a whole lot of detail. The one thing that we've discovered on this is that you can absolutely go down the rabbit hole on this and start trying to litigate every possible variation, and it very quickly turns into a very unpleasant and drawn out conversation as you try to grapple with it. But we certainly do believe that there is a need for some level of indication of how this is intended to operate to give firms a starting point in that discussion. Okay, Tom, with your permission, we'll move on.
You have it.
Okay. So the first part I want to talk about now is just a bit of a recap of where we landed with the comment letters on the effective date paragraphs as it was in the explanatory memorandum. So we proposed an 18-month implementation period, and for those of you that were on the board last year, you'll remember back in September we gave the board a little mini update on where we stood with these. I've repeated it in both the in the issues paper and in this slide here, and you can always go back to those September papers if you want to read all the detail. But we did just want to sort of feed back and circle back to this point of where we stood with what we proposed about the 18 months. So basically, we didn't get a whole lot of support for the 18-month implementation period. There was a widespread disagreement coming across all stakeholder groups. And obviously, there were pockets of support, so it's not unanimous at all, but there was a level of disagreement that was fairly significant coming from all stakeholder groups. If you turn to the next slide, please, Armand, what you'll see in this slide is we did also ask the question of, well, what alternative would you prefer if 18 months is too short? And the single largest group of commentators supported a 24-month implementation period. The feeling was that that gives you enough time, but not too much. I should mention that in that 24-month period, there will be some people who said at least 24 months. So they were setting 24 months as a minimum. So that's 24 months after the PIOB approved was the way that we put it in the explanatory memorandum. Okay, next slide, please, Armand. So as we had the discussions with the task force chairs and with staff about how to tackle this, there were a couple of things that we had to take into account. And the first one was that the original approval date, way back when we were first, working on these, on the effective date paragraphs for the exposure drafts, was that we would actually be approving in March. Now, because of the volume of comments, we moved that to June, and because of the pandemic, we moved it to September. So we're obviously tracking around about 6 months past the original planned date of approval, which was maybe a little over-optimistic from the start, but we are where we are. We also had to deal with the pandemic itself, of course, and so that's not so much from our side. I mean, from our side, we've been able to pretty much maintain operations in a fairly significant way. But we do also have to take into account that this has had a significant deleterious effect on firms' ability to implement their systems of quality management, to make the changes, and to coordinate their own activities, particularly for those that have larger networks. And I suspect many of the smaller firms may be busy sort of trying to keep the lights on as much as worrying about a standard that hasn't been approved yet. So as we look at these things, we've had to take into account those two big factors. The objective of the task force chairs in this, and I will invite them to come in at any point in this conversation if they want to add some more color or correct me if I make a mistake. But the objective of the task force chairs in this process was really to balance the public interest in improving quality, which is obviously our first and foremost concern here. But it needs to be balanced with enough time to properly implement the standards. And the reason why that second part matters, and it's so absolutely critical, is because if a rushed implementation will likely result in us not getting all the public interest benefits that we set out to get from this project. And if we don't capture all those benefits, then we run the risk of actually not meeting expectations for this project. So the view was very clearly that we have to allow firms enough time. Now, the question is, of course, how long is enough time? And so we did some pretty significant outreach to try to work out what that was. And obviously we have the feedback from the respondents as well. So one of the first discussions we had was that the original date, the way that it worked out, if we had have had the March approval and we had an 18-month implementation period, would have meant that the effective date of the standards would have been, on or about December 2021. So one of the first conversations we had with the task force chairs was to say, is this date still viable? Bearing in mind the delay in the approval of the standards, bearing in mind the pandemic. And first of all, there's a couple of things we noticed there. It's actually only going to be 12 months after the PIOB approval is expected to be received. We note that that is vastly shorter than what most of the respondents would have accepted, and that it's not going to allow anywhere near the time needed for translation and local adoption requirements. So we're putting ourselves in a pretty invidious position. So the view of the task force chairs was that December 2021 is simply not a viable option anymore. It doesn't even comply with the what we had in the explanatory memorandum, because that was an 18-month implementation period. So for those reasons, we took it off the table fairly swiftly. So just turning to the next page, what I'm going to do is pass on to you the feedback we've received from various outreach activities that we did. And again, if anyone was on those calls and they want to come in and add some color, feel free. First of all, the National Auditing Standard Setters, we spoke to them about it. There was pretty widespread support for a December 2022 date. One of the key concerns that they had was that there needed to be early adoption available, not required, but available. So that would help for some people that felt that they could push ahead a little bit faster because of the regulatory situation in their countries. We did get some varying level of conversation about where this might be difficult in one place or easier in another. And I think, Tom was on that call, and in summarize, he made the point that it sounded like most of those related to individual jurisdictional issues. So not necessarily something that a global board can, can deal with too much, though obviously it is a factor that we need to take into account. Secondly, we spoke with IAASB. This call was a little different to the other ones. It actually happened in the context of a wider conversation, so we only had a very small amount of time to talk to them about quality management at all. And really the only question we got from them was they asked whether we were considering a staged implementation. And what a staged implementation means is basically that we would have one effective date for some firms and a second effective date for other firms. That was discussed back when we did the exposure drafts and rejected at the time as being just too difficult to manage at a global level. These things are usually done by means of size tests. And at a global level, the size tests that we would write may not actually be terribly relevant to anyone. So, the feeling was this was a matter best left for national jurisdictions to think about if they really want to. Another conversation we had was with the International Forum of Independent Audit Regulators. Again, there was widespread support for the December 2022 date. They did actually note that the issues paper had flagged pretty much all the same issues and considerations that they had, which was very pleasing to see. They did express a concern that if it was later than December 2022, they would probably have an issue with that. They also asked a question about whether we were considering the staged implementation. So they got the same answer that we gave to IAASB. Just turning to the next slide, the last group we spoke to was actually one of the first groups. It's just I've put them in a slightly different order for the purposes of this presentation. We spoke to the Global Public Policy Committee, which, as you know, is the 6 largest firms. We spoke to them quite early in the process, earlier and before we actually had a decision by the QM chairs on what the effective date should be. So because of that, it was more in the space of discussing considerations, where they've stood with their implementation activities, how they were finding the process of implementation had been affected by the pandemic. And so we got some overall observations from them. First of all, COVID-19 was having an effect on resources, and they were actually having to transform parts of their businesses already to deal with remote work. And so things that had once been well understood, policies and procedures were now having to be amended. So that was going to involve a dedication of resources to achieve it. They did also note that restrictions on movement, we're all operating in a Zoom world now, and that had slowed down some of the normal meetings they would have where they sort of drag people in from around the world to sit in a room and sort something out. Now they were having to do it via Zoom, and like, us limited therefore by, the time zones and that to how much of that they can get done in one go. So they had noticed that had slowed down. And of course, these are all specific to individual firms. Not all the firms would have expressed all these views. One important point that was made was that there is an urgent need to settle down the standards. And their point was, if you're going to ask the firms to start work on the implementation and adoption work early, start amending their processes, they really need, particularly QM1 lockdown, at least in substantive form, as soon as possible, because they really can't work around. And, they made mention of things like deficiencies. If we don't know what a deficiency is, it's a little hard for us to get too far down the path of working out what our quality management system should look like. Obviously, there's work that can be done, but not all of it. Just some other observations that were made. Implementation efforts are going to involve continual learning and adjustments. They may have to run both systems concurrently in some places for a while, just to enable that handoff between the two systems. Okay, lucky last. The other point that was just made was, and we talked about this one on Monday, was that just to take into account the fact that there are a lot of effective dates coming up over the next few years. Obviously 315, the QM standards, and then 600. And obviously we spoke about that one on Monday. So just to reiterate, with the GPPC, we didn't actually have a date to propose to them to get a reaction to, so we didn't talk about it so much. My feeling was that they would have preferred, would have been, I think, would have found it quite difficult to accept the December 2021 date. That's a starting point. Okay, just moving on to the next slide. We're up to the question now, but just before we get into that, there's a couple of things I just wanted to talk through. First of all, a couple of people have mentioned Nathalie's paper, the agenda item 8B, which is the PowerPoint slides with the voiceover. The reason why we thought this was a good idea to prepare was because when the task force chairs were having these discussions, we did have a few times where we discovered that it's actually quite hard to follow it if we just do the timelines, because you have to really read them very, very closely, and it is a little hard to do. So the idea of the voiceover was really to try to help people understand the flow of when engagements start and finish. This was supported by some very, very exhaustive discussions, and I think everyone who was in the room when we had these ones will remember with a little bit of fear and trepidation having those discussions again. We did go into a lot of detail about various options, and a lot of that was really trying to see if there was any other options available to us. So for example, could we early adopt 220? Could we push, sorry, when I say early adopt, could we move the implementation date for ISO 220 before the other two standards? We tried to see whether that was working, and we worked out, after quite a lot of discussion, that it just doesn't work. You can't make it work. You end up having to rewrite some fairly significant parts of 220 and ISQM 1 and 2 in order to make it work. The view was that was simply not in line with what we were trying to do with these standards. We'd end up having to have two sets of standards almost going out at the same time, which is just too much of a shock to the system. One of the things that we did find as well was that moving to a new system will inevitably involve a changeover period, and that's irrespective of the date. At some point, you're just going to have to work out how to turn off one system and turn on the other one, and that's going to produce some dislocations. It's going to produce some findings that you may have purely because the system has changed. And that's okay. That's entirely the point of a quality management system, is to work out whether there's anything useful I need to take away from the fact that I now have something went well or something went badly under the new system versus the old. And that's all that's part of the process that everyone's going to have to go through of this continual improvement. On this call, we really don't want to get into all the possible variations. I know it's a little bit tempting to start to ask yourself, but what if this happens, then how is this treated? I think those are really best addressed either to staff directly, or we can talk about it. By all means, send us an email and we'll respond to it. We have been down the rabbit hole on this one, like I mentioned. There is a limit as to how much we can really convey on a call like this. But I do want to just note that if there is anything that we find that really does need explanation, as I said earlier, we can put this into an FAQ if there really are some points that are very difficult. The last thing I just want to mention, and I have covered this a little bit, the plan is at the moment that we don't split the standards, so we don't have different effective dates for them, and also that we don't have any sort of staged implementation, implementation by size of firm or other characteristic. We have explored them all. They didn't take us anywhere. After having spent quite a bit of time on them, we came to the conclusion that they were simply not in line with the objectives of the project. So on that, I will pause and hand it back to you, Tom, to take us through the questions. So the proposal is that the effective dates for the QM standards all be December 15, 2022.
Yeah. Brett, I'm reminded of our conversation that we had with the different IFER working groups, where they sort of went through the same process that the task forces inevitably had, where I think they sort of came up with a sort of a Goldilocks approach. Clearly they want to get the standards out as soon as practical, but then they start to think of all the other circumstances involved, including the COVID crisis, but also thinking about the other standards that come in online, such as ISO 315, and they sort of talk themselves into exactly where the staff proposal finds itself. The task force proposals find itself being December 15, 2022. And so I found that sitting down with other public interest authorities around that discussion is particularly informative and given me some comfort with the task force proposals. Let me open it up for comment. If you're simply supportive, you could a simple yes will suffice, or at the end I could wrap up to assuming yes. If you have comment, obviously we will welcome them as well. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. My answer is yes. Thanks.
Should not even put myself on mute when we get those responses. Jim Dowkin. Still on mute.
Thanks, Tom. Is that working?
Yeah, that's working.
This was an area of significant discussion at the CAG meeting with concerns with the other dates. So this is in the supportive of our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Bob?
Yes, thanks.
Yes. Fernando?
In favor, Tom.
Great. Isabel?
Supportive. It has always been the CMCC position.
We can't hear you, Isabel.
Can you hear me now? Is it better?
A little better, yeah.
Yeah. Supportive, and it has always been a CNCC position, but we should have 2 years due to the specific nature of this standard. And keeping in mind that we also have to translate and endorse the standards before training the people and having the standard come into force. So it's quite a long process. So very supportive of what. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Sachika?
Thank you. I support. But relating the effectivity, maybe one thing we need to consider is the linkage to 600 and 220. I mean, because now we need to implement revised 600 later date from QM standard, and particularly there is strong linkage to 220 and 600. So I think perhaps we need to analyze whether there is any disconnect between 220 revised and extant 600 to make sure that people can apply 220 revised with the extant 600 appropriately. But if effective date itself, I fully support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachiko. I know that's a topic that's been considered at length, but I'm sure we'll get back to that after the other comments. Fiona?
Yes.
Josephine?
Sorry, I was on mute. I'd like to, I didn't take the opportunity earlier to express my thanks to task force chairs and the other members of the task force involved in these discussions. I know they've been long and difficult, and of course for the outreach. But of course, it'll be no surprise to you all that I'm disappointed with the decision on December 15, 2022. I would have preferred June, and I totally understand the arguments around practicality right now and the need to be flexible in respect of COVID, etc. But certain stakeholders in my jurisdiction believe, as pointed out in paragraph 20, that the latter dates inappropriately delay what is really needed quality improvements that were discussed as far back as 2011 in that post-clarity implementation review. So this is, though, particularly true of ISO 220, where the quality improvements needed there won't be seen now until December 2023 year ends. So in that respect, I do agree that early adoption of the QM standards should be encouraged. And I also believe we should be clear that adopting QM standards as a package should not, though, be used as a reason to avoid early adoption if we can. So that's my position on that. Thank you for the time. And I apologize for not being a quick yes.
Rich.
Agree with the effective dates with a however. So similar to Sajiko, the 220 and 600 connection does put a little concern with me, but I would have gone the other way. I'm probably the only one, but as we all have different express different views. I would have delayed 220 to be in line with 600, so you don't have the extant 600 for a period of time. But I'm also, it sounds like the rest of the board going that way. I'm also okay with the effective dates, and I guess we're going to get to the question 3 later, so I'll come in on the encouragement in the next question.
Sue?
Yes, support. Also had the similar question around the 220, 600 link, but very supportive of this and as a package. Thank you.
Right, Chun Li?
Yes from me.
Thank you, Chun Li. Kai Morton?
Yes.
Karen?
Yes, I just wanted to say that it's understandable, although disappointing, that the date is being moved out. But we should be cognizant of the fact that if the economic implications of COVID over the next year worsen, there could be pressure to change this date again. And the board should be considering the fact that, as Josephine has said, 2023 should be the latest date and no further delays. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Roger?
Support the effective date.
Eric?
I support the effective date as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so you have near unanimous support for the proposal, the effective date. Let me just say something about the 220, 600 issue. I don't want to prolong discussion on it because 600's out for comment, and I think we have to be very careful to assume anything on that, how that process will lay out. And certainly the demand for these QM standards is there. And for the precise tensions that we've heard voiced on why to go faster or slower. So, I find that an important point or practical reality, but I also don't think we should be assuming anything on the 600 timetable and can't really afford to wait, from my perspective, to get these QM standards effective at the latest December 15th, 2022. With that, Brad, I turn it back to you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks very much for the messages of support for this one. just maybe turning back to a couple of points. So the linkage between 220 and 600, Lynn, I might turn to you in a moment just to talk about this one, and Len as well, of course, if you have any observations. Just, you know, speaking on my own behalf, I know that from what I've witnessed at the task force meetings, there's been a lot of concern about making sure that that 220 will work with extant 600. So we've put a lot of time and effort into making sure that we don't break anything in the process. This may mean that we actually need to do some minor conforming amendments back to 220 when 600 is finalized. There are a couple of paragraphs that might shift around a little bit, but the shifts are fairly minor. The changes are not terribly significant because of the way that we've drafted them. Just in terms of whether there's anything else, I do hear that the disappointment about the it would be great if we could have done an earlier date. I think at this point we really have tried, and we have to be respectful of that. And I see Josephine nodding there. I should mention that both Josephine and also Denise Weber participated in some of the task force chairs calls, and I really do thank them for their input, because they really did help us sharpen some of our thinking as we went through some of the practicalities of this. Let me just pause there for a moment. Lynn or Len, did either one of you want to say anything about the 220-600 link?
Lynn, you go first, and then I'll complete it.
Yeah, thank you. I should have raised my hands earlier, Tom, because I was involved in this agenda paper, so I didn't say anything. But I'm just trying to reflect Josephine's comments about perhaps the early adoption. I know we've done a lot of outreach, but in my outreach, I know we spoke to IAASB, we spoke to IFIA as a group, but when the discussion is taking place at the regional level, there's still a lot of opinion in terms of whether 2022 December might be too late. I think in our original plan, had we approved the standards in June, we're talking about 24 months, and also we did talk about 18 months in our previous agenda paper. So just wondering whether, at least in the basis of conclusion, when the standards are issued, we need to make sure we are sensitive to some regulatory comments regarding early implementation. I know we are encouraging early implementation, but at least we need to make sure we provide the stakeholders, at least how we arrived at the December 2022 date, and while we have not explored the 18-month period, because there are still demands by certain regulator on early adoption. So I just want to support what Josephine has said. On ISA 600 and 220, I think, Tom, you're right. We have exposure out there. We have a specific questions on the implementation period, and I think it's too early. And I do take comments about how 220 and 600 work together. Our goal is to make sure we get 600 out, and also based on the comment letter we're going to be receiving, whether additional guidance is needed, a bridging document, but would be important to hear from the stakeholders in a common period process. And I'll leave it to Lynn to supplement.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Brett, for presenting this on our behalf. The 220 and the 600 task forces have a lot of joint membership, and that, I think, has served us well. It's keeping those two documents in line. We, as Lynn said, we're now out on consultation on 600, so we'll get a flavour of where people are thinking in terms of that standard. I think it would be tragic if we held 220 back for a extra year to wait for 600. I believe it can be implemented with the extant 600. It was written with that in mind. And if we need to do conforming amendments, which I wouldn't expect to be very many, we can do those back from 600. So for those people that are concerned about the current proposed implementation effective date, if we hold back 220, it's a lot longer. So I think it's prudent and sensible in order to achieve our objective of improving audit quality to proceed with the package we've got at present and the effective date that seems to have majority support with early adoption.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Lynn. We're going to leave this discussion at 600 and 220 there. People who raised it had no objection with the proposed effect, no real objection to the effective date. I think they were putting it on their radar screen as an issue for continued consideration. So I suggest, Brett, that we accept the board's great majority view about the effective dates and move on to question 3.
Yep, thanks for that, Tom. Okay, so just a couple of very quick points on question 3. The board's usual position is that we don't prohibit early adoption, and so we're proposing to keep that as in place for this one. The one caveat is we did, as I mentioned in the previous conversation, we did spend some time exploring whether we could permit early adoption of the standards individually. After some of those very long-winded conversations, we really did come to the view that it just doesn't work. The standards are tied too closely together to allow it. So what we're proposing is that we indeed encourage early adoption, but it must be as a package. You have to take on all 3 standards. Now, there is an important caveat here. There is absolutely nothing to stop people from early adopting realistically at a firm level. It's just as a legislative package, as a package of requirements, they have to be adopted together. But there's absolutely nothing that stops anyone from picking up all the good thinking in 220 and putting it into practice right now. As fast as you can, because most of it is relatively easy to do that way. Equally for for something like QM1, a lot of the policies and procedures will probably be adopted by firms on a staggered basis. You'll start to work on one section or one component, and then you might move on to another one. That's up to firms as to how they solve that. We don't need to tell them how to do it, but you will see parts of this start to come in much earlier than that as firms do it. So the effective date is the last possible date. It's not the earliest possible date. It's just that as a package of reforms, they need to move hand in hand, or else we end up with some missteps. So just quickly here, the question for the board is, do we agree that early adoption of the QM standards as a package should be encouraged?
Sorry, let me unmute. Let me do this a little bit differently than we had previously. If you're in support of that point without qualification, please raise your hand digitally, and then I can do it. And then otherwise, if you want to comment, I'll get comments quickly. But we were spending a lot of time getting just yeses. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I have 12 who are Eric, Chudwee, Lynn, Kai Morton, Fernando, Roger, Kaiue, Sue, Julie, Len, Sachika, all are in support of that position with an absolute yes. Okay, if you lower your hands, that would be helpful, and then I'll allow others to comment. So Eric and Rich, and then Fiona. Oh, so people are going to comment. Okay, we're going to do it this way. Eric.
Sorry, I'm struggling to lower my hand.
Oh,
no comment.
Okay. Rich.
Yeah, so I, including early adoption and as a package makes sense to me, and I have no problem with that. I have a problem with encouraging early adoption, not only just theoretically, but just based on what we just seen in the paper, which gives all these disadvantages. And we know this is holistic. We know it's 3 whole standards. It's very important standards that we want to make sure are done right. So it sort of seems like we're then disregarding what we just decided, that this is an important thing, we got to get it right, to then encourage early adoption. I think the idea of allowing it, absolutely, but in reality, I think the practical thing is what Brett has said. No one's going to early adopt unless someone tells them they have to. But what people will do is they will do parts of it. They'll pilot it, they'll take good things, start changing but no one's going to come out and say, I am in accordance with ISQM1 before that date. Again, unless some territory requires that. But that doesn't mean, I don't see why we need to encourage that when we know there's issues with rushing this. Thanks.
So, Rich, your proposal would be the board's position should be that the board permits early adoption, not encourages early adoption.
That's correct. That's correct.
We'll have that on the table for
Thank you.
Potential reconsideration. Fiona?
Yeah, I'm the same. I don't believe we should be encouraging it. I think we should allow for early adoption and then leave it up to jurisdictions to determine if they'd require early adoption or a different date. But we should just allow for it, not encourage it.
Okay. Josephine?
Well, I'd already said earlier that I do agree that early adoption of QM standards should be encouraged, certainly permitted. But just to reiterate that we should be clear that adopting QM standards as a package shouldn't be used as a reason to avoid early adoption.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yes, early adoption of an IAASB standard is always possible. I was struggling with the word encourage, because if we do so, do we mean that a firm that has not early adopted will do a lower quality audit than a one that is early adopting? So that's my point. And on top of that, when we discussed it to prepare in France, we saw some other complexities. We have a French-specific complexity, but it does exist in some other countries with a joint audit. What if a joint auditor early adopts and the other one does not early adopt? Or are we going to disclose that in the report? And what about component auditor? If a component auditor is not from the same firm and is not early adopting and is not in a position to early adopt, is it an issue? So to us, it was really challenging. If it's only one firm, you can early adopt, there's not big issues. But when you have several firms working together, we thought it was quite complex to encourage. Thank you.
Okay. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Similar to others, I just fundamentally have a problem with a standard setting board encouraging implementation at an earlier date than the effective date, because that seems to just send a message that the effective date that was established really wasn't what was intended if you have to encourage people to do it sooner. So I'm perfectly comfortable with permitting early implementation, but decisions about encouraging, I think, should be left to a jurisdictional level, perhaps a regulatory body, oversight bodies, those types of bodies could encourage early implementation. And I have the same concerns about the message then from firm to firm. If one adopts before another one, does that mean that one is lower quality and things like that? So okay with permitting early implementation, but do not like the encouragement. Thanks.
Okay, Len?
I just want to support what Bob just said, and also Rich and Fiona's suggestion to use the wording permitted. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me repose the question that I asked originally. I know Josephine's position because she was explicit about that, but it seems to me, based upon previous precedent, that we generally don't encourage, we permit early adoption along the lines that was proposed. If people are more content with permitting early adoption as a package as proposed, and I know Josephine has the caveat, it shouldn't be, we shouldn't use the group of three package element as a way, as an excuse not to, but I'm not sure how we manage that point. We could consider whether language should be included in the bases. I don't think we have to resolve that issue today, but who's in the camp of supporting permitting early adoption as a package? Raise your hands right now. It's the overwhelming majority here. I'm in support of that. I think it's compelling, the arguments that have been made in that regard. Okay, we can move on. Right, lower your hands, please, if you can figure it out.
Tom, shall we move to the next section?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so very last, and I'll cover this off quite quickly. We've got the implementation support activities, and we thought we'd just give you a quick update on this one. We've got, in the exposure drafts, we did ask a question about what implementation support activities would be beneficial. You will have seen that we posted an agenda item 8C, which includes the in vivo reports that's, explain what we received on exposure. There are interesting insights in there that staff can pursue in terms of which topics to pursue, when we're developing implementation support material. In terms of the forms of implementation support material that we talked about, there were requests for examples, frequently asked questions, templates, case studies, diagrams, flowcharts, webinars, workshops, a range of things to do. There was also quite a few respondents who talked about the IFAC ISQC1 guide and whether that was going to be updated. And there were some themes coming out of topics, and I've not included all of them here, but just a little smattering: risk assessment processes under QM1, how the standards deal with service providers and networks and other parties like that are a little different to the firm itself, and also impairment of EQRs and how that works through. So next slide, please. So in terms of our implementation support plan, what we're proposing is that we're going to follow pretty much what's been done and is being done with ISO 315. So basically, there will be 5 parts to the implementation support plan. There was a first-time implementation guide, fact sheets, a staff FAQ, webinars, and we're going to do some more of those multimedia resources, those little animated clips with the voiceover that helps people understand it a little bit easier. We can put them on Twitter and LinkedIn, and really help drive some understanding of what we've released in a fairly simple and user accessible way. There's one thing I will mention here. You would have seen in the previous slide there was a reference to templates. We are not supportive of doing anything resembling a template or a checklist. That tends, we've found in the past, to just undermine a lot of the hard work we put into getting auditors to think hard about what they're doing. So we don't want to prepare those sorts of things. That's not to preclude other parties from doing it. They're often going to be closer to the markets that they're dealing with. But at a global level, we're reluctant to give that any further consideration. I will, with this one, just talk about that very last bullet point on the slide, managing resources and expectations. We are very conscious that this is a topic where the requests tend to be unlimited for resources, for more implementation support. We found that with a lot of our recent standards, we really need to concentrate on getting this done quite swiftly. So the focus is therefore going to be on the initial period after we finalize the standards. It will not be a drawn out exercise. There will be a place for other people to pick up the torch and run with it once we get past this initial period, but our wheelhouse, our area of focus, our concerns really need to be over that initial period after finalisation. So we will probably have to make some hard decisions through that process because we will not be able to satisfy everyone. The staff, obviously have other projects that they have to move on to. So this very much becomes an important piece of work for the staff, but we do have a work plan to deliver. And so we've got some time set aside for this activity, but it does end. So I just wanted to convey that thought. That's all I wanted to say on that topic. Tom, maybe I'll just turn back to you at this point.
Okay, I don't see that was information. Rich, you'd like to come in?
Yeah, so I mean, it's great, and people do want to see this, and I think Brett, the comments, I think are good, that you really need to try to get this out as soon as you can. I also think we need to manage our stakeholders. There's a lot of early dates you have there, and it just seems a little impractical that we'll be able to get those out. You're only going to get the vote, the PIOB vote, in whatever, November, December, and that's what basic conclusion comes with that. And so there'll be some stuff. It just seems doing a lot of stuff in the fourth quarter and then the first quarter next. I mean, if you honestly believe that these dates are all achievable, then I don't have an issue. I just think they seem to be very aggressive, and I'd rather be not have our stakeholders think that we're missing dates.
Okay. Thank you, Rich. I think that's was meant to be informational. That's good advice, Rich. We should be realistic about managing public expectations. I don't see any other hands up, so I suggest we move to the next topic. Really, thank you, Brett, for walking us through agenda paper 8.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. Obviously, I'm not Imran. I'm a bigger version of Imran, but we've at least decided to keep it within the country bounds. So also being from South Africa, Imran has asked me to do this. No, that wasn't the reason why. But Imran can't join us for the first hour and a half of the session. So I've decided that I will step in and do this. We've got Hanken on the call as well. Dan is on the call as well. So if they can also come in as needed. So in agenda item 8A, we wanted to deal with the only matter at this meeting where ISQM2 is involved. So the ISQM task force really doesn't have any significant issues that they wanted to bring to the board for the June meeting, except this one matter regarding coordination with the ethics board. So the purpose of this session is really to just give the board an update on the progress of the work made by the IAASB task force that's dealing with their project on objectivity of engagement quality reviewers, and then also to get the board's feedback on whether we are happy that the proposals are sufficiently aligned to ISQM2. So as I've indicated, the material is in agenda item 8A. So Armand, we can move to the next slide. So you will remember the last time we spoke about this back in March and April, the calls we had. The IAASB exposure draft on this topic had just closed. The comment period just closed at the end of March, and they were busy. They were in the process of analyzing the comments. So what happened is at their June meeting last week, they took their proposals based on the ED through to the board for discussion. And the task force really had 4 key proposals that they took to the IAASB board last week. So in putting these proposals forward, the ethics board was were clearly trying to be responsive to the comments they received on the exposure draft, while also being mindful of the position of the IAASB on the objectivity of engagement quality reviewers, a position that we've reached after extensive deliberation and discussion of this matter, and particularly in December 2019 and in our meetings in March and April. But they have decided to retain, as it was presented in ED, to retain the decision not to prescribe a cooling off period in the code, to keep it to a principles-based approach within the code, and that it is more appropriate for the IAASB to determine whether a cooling off requirement should be introduced in ISQM 2. They have, however, decided to broaden the scope of the provisions, where the ED went out and dealt with the objectivity of the engagement quality reviewer on processing the comments that they've received and further deliberation. They've decided that it is more appropriate that the code deals with the objectivity of appropriate reviewers, which is a broader category than only engagement quality reviewers. So to broaden the scope of those requirements, of those principles around objectivity, to apply to appropriate reviewers, which is a pre-existing term in the code. That term is already in the code, and it provides for anybody that performs the role or function of a reviewer, which can be a lot of different types of reviews across engagements or within firms. And as far as it relates to ISQM 2, they're really just suggesting to take the pre-existing definition and just add a sentence at the end that would basically read, an engagement quality reviewer appointed under proposed ISQM 2 is an appropriate reviewer. And that sentence will just be added to the existing definition. Then they've also had the proposal that the section that was in the ED proposed to be included in section 120 of the code, that's the section that deals with the conceptual framework, that section be moved out and be included in part 3 of the code. So it's just a move. It's really not any change of substance in terms of the content. Part 3 of the code deals with professional accountants in public practice, and they've proposed that as section 325 in that section. The only additional change they've made, well, there's a few small editing changes and crisping up of wording and so on. But as it relates to ISQM 2, the change they've made is the introduction of an additional paragraph in that section under the heading addressing threats to objectivity, and that would be the hook to ISQM 2. And basically that paragraph will read, proposed ISQM 2 sets out a requirement for firms to establish policies or procedures to specify a cooling off period to address threats to objectivity created by an individual being appointed as an engagement quality reviewer after previously serving as the engagement partner. So that paragraph will be added to that section. So those were really the 4 big proposals that the task force took to the ethics board last week, and that was discussed. So Armand, you can go to the next slide. So basically then, just to confirm, on discussion and deliberation of this at the ethics board meeting last week, 2 of the key proposals that received unanimous support from the ethics board, and there were no objections to this, is that consistent with the ED, the IAASB code will retain a principles-based approach to address objectivity. Within this section, this new section then that deals with the objectivity of appropriate reviewers, and dealing with identifying threats to objectivity, evaluating threats, and addressing threats. And then there was also unanimous support for to continue to, in coordination with the IAASB, that the IAASB is best placed to determine whether a cooling off requirement should be introduced in ISQM 2. And we know that looking at ISQM 2 paragraph 16 and 16a, that we've got that requirement, and that's the position that we've reached after our discussions in December and in March and April. There were 2 smaller, there were 2 other proposals at their board meeting last week where there were 1 or 2 concerns raised, and that was really related to firstly the positioning of the section in part 3 of the code. So it will be in part 3, but it might be moved around. The numbering may change, but it will still be in part 3. And then the other one was there was some comments at their board meeting that the task force should be much clearer or present in a clearer way the rationale for why they've broadened the scope to the broader concept of appropriate reviewers. But the task force was happy to take those comments on, and they are still fully confident that they will move towards approval of the proposals at their September meeting. So the next slide, please, Armand. So really that brings us to the questions for this section, which are focused on alignment. So really what our board is asked for is, are you happy that there's sufficient alignment, or that there is alignment between the proposed revisions in the IAASB code relating to the objectivity of appropriate reviewers and the objectivity of the engagement quality reviewer as it is presented in ISQM 2, and whether there are any other matters that we should be considering in terms of achieving such alignment. So Tom, thank you very much. I'll turn that back to you.
And Vili, obviously, as our lead technical advisor, you believe that that alignment's been achieved, plus that the code and our standards actually continue to remain aligned on a go-forward basis.
Yeah. So Tom, maybe just on that. So I've highlighted to the board the two places there's going to be the extra sentence to the definition of appropriate reviewer. And there's going to be that extra paragraph in this new section 3 to 5 that will provide the hook to ISQM 2. And on the ISQM 2 side, the task force has already looked at that. Obviously, there's been coordination with the IAASB team on this. And in one of the A paragraphs in ISQM 2, we're just updating the reference to engagement quality reviewer to say the code refers to appropriate reviewer, which includes, for example, an engagement quality reviewer.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So any comments on it, Fiona?
Yes, no, and no.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, Tom, I think I'm supportive with the changes proposed by IAASB. I think if I recall, there are only 2 examples of safeguards to deal with the objectivity threat that are provided, one being a cooling off period, the second being reassigning the reporting roles. And then it rolls right into the reference to ISQM 2. So I think that's a pretty strong steer towards the cooling off period. And so I'm fine with where we're at with this. Thanks.
Thank you. Josephine?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'm comfortable with what they're proposing, and I also support the proposed revisions in respect to question 2. Vili, I wonder if you might ask the task force to consider whether the wording in paragraph 300.6A1 and similarly in 325.5A1, it's in respect of concerns that were raised that people might think an appropriate reviewer could be someone senior on the team, and I can see why they might assume that. It says in the wording an individual who serves as an appropriate reviewer on an engagement, and perhaps if they could consider changing on an engagement to something like for an engagement, because on the engagement might imply the individual as part of the engagement team. Now, I don't know if that would work in the way that their code's written, or maybe that's the way they set out their requirements, but just a thought to maybe help with some of those views that are coming through on the appropriate reviewer. Thank you.
Thank you. Sachiko?
Thank you. Question 1, I think ISQM 2 is okay. And question 2, I think if it will be applied to appropriate reviewer, mean that it will be applied not only EQO but also other reviewers, such as reviewer who perform inspection of a completed engagement as a monitoring procedures, and looking at more management standard ISQM 1 and 2. While eligibility of EQR is discussed in ISQM 2, the eligibility of other appropriate reviewers are not so much discussed, except for sort of general requirement. So if we expand the scope of section 3 to 5 into all appropriate reviewers, I wonder whether there is a need to have some guidance for eligibility of appropriate reviewers other than EQR in ISQM 1 in more specific manner. And other comment I have is actually it's not directly relevant to question in the agenda paper, but when I read IAASB issue paper, question was popping up in my mind, so I would like to raise that if I may. According to the IAASB June meeting agenda, which is I think paragraph 50 to 51 of agenda item 5A, it implies that the more experienced member who reviews work of less experienced members within the engagement team would also be defined as an appropriate reviewer. It means that not only a reviewer outside the engagement team, but also one inside the team would be appropriate reviewers and who are in the scope of section 325. But I think the reviewer inside the team has a role of direction and supervision over the less experienced member. So their roles are very different from those of reviewer outside the team. So I think it would be appropriate to consider both inside, outside reviewer in the same way by categorizing in the concept of appropriate reviewer. So I know this issue should be discussed at IAASB and is not a matter directly related to IAASB, but it would be helpful if you could explain background or reason why the IAASB addressed the matter in this way. But it's just a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. I'm supportive of the alignment that's taken place. I just have one question as to whether the long association rules that are in the IAASB have been considered in relation to where we are with the cooling off period for the EQRs, and whether there's any confusion that might arise around those two different periods. But apart from that, I'm supportive of where we've ended up.
Karen?
I think Eric has asked the same question I was going to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Rich?
I'm supportive of where we're at on this, so agree and no. Thanks.
Julie?
I'm also in agreement. So my answer to 1 would be yes, and my answer to 2 would be I don't have any further changes. We did have one small consideration for an editorial change, and we'll send that through offline. Thank you.
Dan Martin?
On question 1, agree, and on to no further changes.
Sue?
Question 1, agree. Question 2, I had some questions around the appropriate reviewer. I think Willie has covered them in the description, but I did like Josephine's suggestion, if that was practical, to reference for an engagement rather than on an engagement. Thank you.
Roger?
Yeah, yes to question 1 and nothing to add on question 2. I think well done on the coordination. They weren't easy issues, so well done.
Isabel?
Like Sashiko, I'm quite concerned by the extent of the change that ISBA has done to the code. My understanding was that initially we started by wanting to deal with something specific to the EQR, and I'm not sure I'm perfectly understanding what it means by expanding it to appropriate reviewer. Like Sashiko, I think it has unintended consequences on many other provisions, and that it may have also some unintended consequences on some other ISA, and maybe it's something that we would have to consider. But except that, regarding what we are doing in ISQM2, I'm happy with what we're keeping in ISQM2 on objectivity of EQR. But really, the scope of this BAP project, I'm not sure I understand all the consequences of what they have done. Thank you.
Len?
Yeah, broadly supportive of the alignment. We do have some minor editorial comments were sent through to the task force. Thank you.
Okay. So I read from that really broadly supportive of the questions. There were a couple of, there's a number of comments that I think we need to share with IAASB, which are to some extent not in our direct purview, but are meant to be helpful suggestions. There was a couple questions about the long association elements with our interaction with our standards. So I turn it back to you to respond and to close up.
Thank you, Tom. So certainly I will, the suggestion that was made about the online engagement versus foreign engagement, we will certainly pass that on to the IAASB team. On the question about whether the definition of an appropriate reviewer will also now apply to anybody within a team that's sort of fulfilling the function within the DSR, a senior person reviewing another person's work. That was addressed in the IAASB issues paper last week as well. And the idea is that those people will also be appropriate reviewers, but obviously the level, they need to be objective, but the level of objectivity is also something that is seen on a spectrum. A senior reviewing a junior's work needs to be objective, because remember, in the bare essence of the requirement, you can't review your own work. So the objectivity will be applied. Well, I need to be able to objectively look at the work that somebody else has done. Whereas it goes up the scale, and the objectivity that is required by an EQ reviewer is obviously at a much higher scale than that. I'll leave it at that. I'll ask Hankin to come in if I've missed anything. Let me just quickly deal with the other questions as well. The other question that I heard was about whether we need to make further changes to the QM standards to also talk a little bit more about eligibility, because we also have other references to reviewers. I don't personally think that's necessary, because in all the QM standards, we have to hook to the relevant ethical requirements. The relevant ethical requirements deals with the principles, the fundamental principle of objectivity, and then the objectivity related to appropriate reviewers, specifically in terms of identifying, evaluating, and addressing threats. The reason why the hook to QM2 is specifically required is because of the specific situation we deal with, in terms of an individual being appointed as an EQ reviewer that previously served as the engagement partner. And that is the reason why that needs to be elevated, because of that. But I don't think that same rationale will apply to the other places where we talk about reviewers. And then the point about long association, remember this has come up before as well. You need to make the distinction that the objectivity in terms of section 3 to 5 in the code and how we've addressed it in ISQ2 addresses a different risk than long association rules. Long association rules addresses independence risk in terms of association with the client. This is a risk in relation to the person performing the engagement quality reviewer. However, we do recognize, and Hankin, you can maybe just correct me if I'm wrong, but in ISQ2, we do have application material that draws attention to that and that alerts a firm to the fact that you do also need to see how these two things would work together if you're looking at an individual person's association at any point in time. So, Tom, I'll just, so I want to do two things. I'll ask Hankin if she wants to come in on anything that I've mentioned. And then I see Imran has joined us. So I'm going to leave to him to just do the final acknowledgements.
I just wanted to comment, Billy, and that you were right in all the responses to the points that were raised in this call. And I just want to remind everybody that the way that both task forces address the long association provisions and how it interacts with ISKM2 is we've decided not to deal with that in the application material, but to simply update the FAQs that was previously issued by the IAASB board, and making sure that it aligns now with the proposals that we have now included in proposed ISKM2. But certainly those are valid concerns, and the FAQs will be updated accordingly. And I'll pass it on to Imran if he had anything else to add.
Welcome, Imran. Your presentation was so good that Billy was able to deal with it flawlessly, and he got good feedback from the board, but it's great to have you on board.
Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon. Who needs a robot when you have Willie? You know, he's made me redundant. But thank you very much, Willie. Thank you for stepping in. It's certainly an example of teamwork. Recognizing where we are this afternoon, this is really a few acknowledgements. The first is that thanks, Tom, for your flexibility to accommodate this schedule. But I took from the few minutes that I have been listening a great deal of support from our board. Particularly, I note the 3 sets of comments from Josephine, Sachiko, and Isabel that Willie has responded to, and others that we should take away and think about. I think, Tom, what's important for us as this board and the ethics board to also appreciate is that this is a very significant point of the 2 boards coming together in agreement. There certainly is a time when, as Roger perhaps suggested 2 years ago, when reconciling the 2 boards' positions on this seemed like a gargantuan task. And certainly there were very strong opposing views in some camps. As the result of the outreach that our board did at the time of the ED and the ethics board did at the time of the ED, I think many more people understand far more clearly today the threat posed by this change of role from engagement partner to EQR. And this is what the process of exposure and discussion has led to, so much so that we now have both boards in exactly the same position, and the ethics board supporting our board. And I think in closing this off, one has to really pay respect and acknowledgement to how hard this has been for everybody involved, and how much of lifting is involved for the colleagues on the ethics board. So, this task force led by Sylvie, supported full-time by Carla and Ken, and they did this at the time when they had 3 different EDs out in the marketplace. Followed a very accelerated timeline to get this done. And we heard at their meeting last week a recommitment on their part on the subject matter of timing, that they're looking forward, as they have been planning from the time of the ED, to be aligned with us for an approval of their changes at the September meeting, considering whatever feedback they got last week. So I really wanted to, on the record, acknowledge the efforts of those boards, and those efforts really bear well for future coordination that Kai Morton will continue to coordinate with them. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Imran. Any other comments on this topic? So we succeeded. We held to our timeline. Okay, what I suggest right now is take a 12-minute break. Before you take a break, just to alert you that the revised minutes based upon comments provided have been posted to the IAASB's website. We are going to hopefully approve those minutes after the break, and then turn to external communications, which is agenda paper 5D. So I say that we reconvene at 7:40 a.m. my time, so in 11 minutes.
Lynn, how's it going in New Zealand? What phase are you in now?
We're back at everything's open except for the borders, but we went 24 days with no new cases, and then we let 2 women out of quarantine who had it. So, you know, it's going to be an ongoing issue, I think. You know, we're all going to have to learn to live with this thing.
Yeah, of course.
If we can't eliminate it, then certainly people with more porous borders and closer together than us are going to struggle. So, but it was a bit irritating.
But you can go out and about now to restaurants and shops, etc.
We had 44,000 people at Eden Park for a rugby game at the weekend.
Oh, fantastic.
So, you know, you wouldn't have thought that that would have happened a month ago, so, which is great. I think that's why people are so angry that the quarantine didn't work and that these 2 women got out.
I read about that in the news, Lynn. That's too bad.
It is too bad. And, you know, we've now got a 3rd one that's in quarantine, which is what quarantine's for, so that's okay. But, yeah, the nation is a bit irritated at present that the systems didn't work.
Well, I'm going to my first patio tonight, and only patios are allowed open outside. That's it.
Oh, that'll
Not
be
everywhere yet either in Ontario.
Oh.
So it'll be interesting.
It will be. It's actually, I found that the first time I went outside the house, I felt actually quite nervy about it. It was all these people, and they might not be safe.
I know. It's like you look at everyone with this eye now of like, I don't know about you.
And also you don't know what to do because, you know, you can't hug them. You're looking and thinking, what, you know, how do I greet people now? And everybody stands around looking rather awkward.
Yeah. I saw, I met with some friends last night at obviously at appropriate distance, and we waved at each other, which was really, we waved while we were walking closer, then we stood there and waved at each other. We were at our 2 meters. It was very strange, but it was lovely to see other faces.
And just have a conversation with somebody else.
Yeah. That isn't a Zoom call or a quiz or
Yeah, I'm sort of getting to feel like I spend a goodly proportion of my life sitting in this seat. And
yeah, I'm sick of my study now, really sick of this room.
So what's it like in the UK?
Well, it's still too high, still too many, tragically, people dying. We've gotten the next update, I think, next week on what phase we're in and what we should be doing. I mean, there are rumours, as I was saying earlier, that we might have a reduced distancing. Some of the more children going back to school, but they'll just have to see and see what happens next with things opening up. Oh yeah, and then some of the non-essential shops have opened up as well. So I think we're going to see another spike, though I'm a bit worried about it. I'm hoping not, but only time will tell. Our government are doing.
I'm actually surprised how quickly the second wave came. You know, it was, we went into level 1 of everything open, and we didn't even get through a week.
We're gonna try to get going. We still have one major topic left to resolve. So if your cameras are off, just reset. Please get ready to turn them on. Okay, waiting, Billy. We've got one more minute. Okay, Eric. I see that we're waiting for. Okay, maybe while we do this, let's clear one thing first. I'm sure you spent the break studying minutes, and we've now the revised agenda item 1 has been posted. I mean, revised minutes have been posted. Could we get a motion to approve our minutes from the previous meetings?
Yep, happy to.
I see nods. I'm taking the nods a
Yep.
second. Any objections to the approval of the minutes as posted? Okay, the minutes are approved. That's what order business. I just was trying to give people a little extra time to get back in. Okay, so the big question the other day was, where did question 8 go? We found where question 8 is. It's on Friday. But this is a really important topic. I think I highlighted it. If you recall our discussion in April, that there was this tension of trying to go beyond optionality for external communications of performance quality management system. And I think the task force went back to consider some of the guidance that was here and the questions that were raised, and is now offering in agenda paper 5D a proposal to address some of the public interest concerns while balancing scalability issues on the other hand. So with that, I turn it to Julie, who will introduce this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I Rich, this is question 8. So you were on it. You caught us. And the task force has bitten off this topic in 2 pieces. So as Tom mentioned, there was a question 8 in our original paper touched on what we amended in this section of the standard with respect to the board's feedback back in the March-April combined meetings. So not a terribly big amount of change as a result of that first paper that was put out, but the larger change, and probably what we're hoping to get feedback on today, is what we presented to you in agenda paper 5D. So maybe we can move the slide. Ooh, it is small for me. So agenda paper 5D, and I'm going to tee this up, and Billy, I'm going to turn it over to you once I'm done. Really what the task force has gone back and considered is, would there be an opportunity to require external communications about the system of quality management to those charged with governance to further enhance that 2-way communication between the auditor and the audit committee or whatever board is charged with governance. And so what we've reflected in paper 5D and in the background discussion is, in addition to the requirement that for audits of listed entities, firms would be required to externally communicate with those charged with governance. And we've kept it limited to for audits of listed entities, primarily to address scalability and also to reflect consistency with other requirements to communicate with those charged with governance or on other matters for audits of listed entities. So I'm hoping you've had a chance to read paper 5D, and that's a brief summary. And Billy, I'm going to turn it over to you to sort of cover the discussions that you've had from a PIOB or public interest perspective.
Thank you, Julie. So I just wanted to give a quick feedback on a conversation we had with the PIOB last week, or the week before probably. It's just before paper 5D was posted. You will remember that, I mean, in trying to clear the runway for the approval in September, we are obviously also very conscious of the list of public interest issues that is published by the PIOB on a quarterly basis. And consistent, the issue around transparency reporting has been on the list of the public interest issues. The most recent list that was published still mentions that ISQM 1 should require audit firms to publish transparency reports. And it also goes on to mention that the minimum content of transparency reports should be included in the standard. Now, I think we as a board has deliberated this many times over the course of the project before ED, as well as when the comments came back last year post ED. And we have tried to see what makes sense, because this is a very difficult topic to deal with, and we acknowledge the fact that whatever solution we come up needs to be as far as possible balanced, flexible, and scalable. And I think with the last proposals in terms of the objective that is set in paragraph 40 and in the specified response in paragraph 41, we are getting very close to that. So there was the final consideration, as Julia said, around those charged with governance as one group within this very broad group of external parties, that it probably makes sense that that is a very specific group where this type of communication can really enhance the two-way communication between the auditor and the audit client, and providing and assisting those charged with governance in actually discharging their responsibilities to provide oversight to the financial reporting process. And that is the requirements that are reflected in 5D. And we discussed that with the PIOB, and they really had, based on what you see in 5D, they had 3 remaining issues around that. The first issue that was brought up was, why are we limiting it to listed entities only? Why don't we just say that this needs to be a requirement that applies to public interest entities? I think that one is fairly easy to deal with, because we don't have the term public interest entities in our standards. We use the construct of elevating certain requirements to a listed entity, and then we use application material to say if there's a requirement that applies to listed entities, you may have to consider that there could be other entities that give rise to similar public interest issues as listed entities, and it may be appropriate to apply that requirement to those entities as well. That's the construct we use throughout our standards. Obviously, there's the PI project currently being undertaken by the ethics board, and once that project comes to a conclusion, we might have to revisit some of the stuff in our standards, but we can't do that now. The other issue they had is that the way that the requirement in agenda item 5D, paragraph 41A, DA, where the marked text indicates that we've inserted and shall require communication with those charged with governance, that gets a little bit lost in a paragraph that starts with when it is appropriate. So the intention was never to indicate that that's a conditional requirement. The intention was to indicate for audits of listed entities, you shall communicate with those charged with governance. So there was a question of whether we can make that a little bit clearer. And then the last issue was, it seems strange that we tell people you have to communicate, but we don't tell them what to communicate about. Now, that's a more difficult one to deal with, because the one thing, and again, going back to the principle of having a flexible, scalable, balanced approach, that we can certainly not come up with a laundry list of things that you should communicate. What we're saying is, what you're going to communicate is you will communicate about your system of quality management. And we've got very robust application material that tells you that when you communicate to external parties, the attributes of that information, examples of what should be communicated, etc. And you must remember, you are dealing with a very specific group here of external parties. You are, as an auditor, probably already engaging with this group, and they will tell you what they want to know as well. So we are steering away from, we can't come up with a laundry list of things that you should be communicating, because it's also a question of where do you stop them? We can't accommodate that in the standard. There was thinking that one could maybe close the loop, because the biggest concern, if you think about it from a perspective of an audit committee chair, there's an audit committee chair, he sits there, he's the audit committee chair for a big listed entity, multinational group, a bunch of shareholders that need to be protected. And that chair says, well, what do I want to ask the auditors? That chair is probably going to be concerned with well, how well does your system work? Are there deficiencies in your system? How do you address those deficiencies? So the monitoring group indicated that they are very much focused on something about monitoring. Now, how that is done, and this has not been discussed, by the task force, but I mean, some initial thinking that we've done internally is it's communicating about your system of quality management, including information about the overall results of your firm's monitoring activities, which is a construct that is already used under the network requirements. That's one way possibly, but like I said, this has not been discussed at all at the task force level. But that was basically the feedback from the PIOB, but in principle, very supportive of the direction that we are taking on this topic. Thank you, Julie.
Julie, turn it back to you, or do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I really covered that very comprehensively, so I don't have anything more at this point, Tom, to add. So I guess we move to the questions. Yeah, we move to the questions on the slide here for the board.
Karen, obviously we described the PIOB's position, and I'd be remiss not to suggest that you may want to comment on it. Otherwise, I'm also happy if you don't and want to reserve judgment till the end of our discussion.
I'll just say now that Billy did an excellent job of covering the issues that the PIOB has raised, and I'm very excited to hear the conversation that occurs now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we turn to question 8. I noticed the font on 8 is even smaller than normal.
I'm having trouble seeing it at all.
Anything, my eyesight has gotten quite poor as a result of this crisis and watching Zoom screens over time, but I could see that it was smaller.
So Tom, I mean, the adjustments we'd made in paper 5A that are incorporated still in 5D. So I don't know if we can take it all sort of as one question, right? Because we'd made those adjustments and then we made further adjustments. So
yeah,
really
I think it's all, it's as a package right now. Fiona?
No comment on the first one. I agree that it's been responsive to the comments you heard from the board, and in terms of this second question, supportive of the proposals that you've got in there as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Josephine?
Yes, great thanks to the task force for working so hard, striking that right balance as well in terms of proportionality. That's my keyword of the week. Supportive of what you've done here. I would suggest that additional comms piece to those charged with governance might be better as a separate requirement. Thank you.
Thank you. And that really sort of responds to the question that the PIOB raised too, that make it clearer. Imran.
Tom, thank you very much and good afternoon again. Firstly, Julie, thank you so much for not only what was on the original papers, but what has been circulated in the supplementary papers. And Billy, thank you so much for explaining the discussion with the PIOB, as well as the 3 issues that they've raised, that as someone who has been raising similar issues over the life of this project, I can identify with them. I think that what 5X represents is certainly a step up and improvement on what we've been looking at in earlier versions, but has not yet reached the point where we were at the time of the ED. And I say this really as a user and as a board member from a marketplace in which we have a great deal of interest and a lot of currency around the topic of transparency reporting. And I think that there's an interesting shift that has happened in the drafting that has been proposed. The drafting that is proposed suggests to us as a board that those charged with governance in the area of quality management are a substitute for the public, and that the public does not have the same interest in the quality of firms who hold a license as those charged with governance has. There'd be many members of the public who would disagree with that principle, because the state provided the license, the public gave the license to the firms, why should they not have an interest, therefore, in how the firms are discharging discharging their responsibilities in relation to the license that they have? So, therefore, the perspective that I've had and the one that I maintain is that the audience for the communication, whatever name we give to that, whether it's a transparency report or something else, is really anyone who wants it when they need it. And that this type of construct will create some kind of communication, but it won't be available to anyone, and it certainly won't be available to anyone when they need it. Even prospective in respect of prospective audits, it won't be available to them either. In respect of the proposal around the scope of firms and limiting that to listed entities, I think that's a logical point, and it's probably where we were at the time of the ED, and we've returned to that point. I think that it's very workable in many Western economies, but I'd like the task force to reflect on whether that is equally relevant in large regions of the world, in developing economies, where actually the largest audits are public sector audits and not those companies listed on the stock market. So if I had to rank the 10 biggest audits in my own country, at least a handful of public sector audits would be as big as private sector audits, and therefore not listed in the traditional sense. But perhaps some application material could, if not already addressed that, could address it. Lastly, on the subject of what is there to be communicated, I recognize the PIOB perspective here. The response, at least as Willie explains it, makes two assumptions. It makes the assumption that those charged with governance are an organized group, and this organized group will come up with a structure about what it is to be communicated. And we know that that's not a reality in many parts of the world. And it makes the assumption that those charged with governance know what they don't know. So they know what to ask to be communicated to them, which we know is also not true, because what does the chairman of a big listed company have on his plate? A whole lot of things in addition to this quality of the audit. So I describe the outline of what is in the standard at the moment as still being basic. And I wish there was still scope for the approval of the standard for us to be more explicit about what is there to be communicated, and to be inspired by so many regions in the world which have provided, not at the granular level, but certainly with a little bit more structure about what can be achieved over there. But certainly appreciative of the direction in which this has moved from the last draft we had, and recognize how much of work has gone into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Imran. Kaiwe?
Thanks, Tom. I have two parts of comments. First one referring to the question mentioned, the paragraph 41A and here little I. For me, it is unclear with whom to communicate because the definition of those charged with governance in ISA 260 is broad, and the application material in ISA 260 thereto clarifies that there may be circumstances when those charged with governance are the same as management, or may just be the owners of an entity. So the question is, does the definition of ISA 260 apply here? This is not clear for me. Furthermore, ISA 260 deals with communication between the auditor, which may be the engagement partner, the engagement team, or the firm, and those charged with governance. ISQM 1 deals with the communication of the firm only. Does this mean that the firm communicates independently of the communication undertaking by the engagement partner and engagement team? For me, without further clarification, it is not clear what the impact of the change of this requirement might be. And therefore, I would not support the requirement as envisaged without such clarification. The second part of my comment refers to the application material A153 FC. First comment refers to the first two sentences. Here it's unclear to me what the purpose of these first two sentences is, since they just repeat what is already required in ISA 260, which is communication by the auditor, not by the firm. Where's the relevance drawn to firm communication? For these reasons, I would delete the first two sentences. And my last comment refers to the last sentence in this paragraph and the three bullet points. That this application material as I have mentioned, last sentence and the bullet points appears to be inappropriate because it suggests additional communication by the auditor to those charged with governance beyond that addressed in ISA 260, which is beyond the remit of this project. The wording does not draw any relevance to communication by the firm. For these reasons, I would delete the last sentence in this paragraph too. Tom, this has been my comments. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. Julie, similar to Kai, this is a new requirement which was not in the ED, so we don't really know what would be the reaction from practitioners and others using the standard, since they didn't have a chance to give a comment, either yes or no or conditional. I think the requirement implies to me, reading, that we're saying that the firm will establish like communications going beyond ISA 260. I don't read that the communication relates to the system of quality management. It's a little bit confusing, and in case we need to decide that we need that statement, I think it belongs more to ISA 260 instead of the ISQM1. As well, I think some of the application material is a little bit repetitive when we talk about what's a requirement in ISA 260. And I'm not against having some kind of application material that clarifies the intention, but I think that leaving that at the level of a requirement is too harsh at this moment. Thanks.
Josephine, I saw you raise your hand. Is that the famous two-handed raise? Come on in.
Sorry to interrupt. Fernando, I just want to clarify your point. You think that additional requirement belongs in 260. Is that because you believe it should only apply in respect of audits of financial statements and not to the wider engagements that fall under ISQM1? Thank you, Tom.
Fernando?
Yeah, well, I'm not really against of having something that says that in other types outside audits of listed entities, there should be communication with those charged with governance. It could be reviews, AUPs, or just ISA 3000 engagements. And I'm fine with that. It seems like if we want that specific requirement, we should say it in that way clearly here. But if we refer to audits of listed entities, I think it should go to 260, because that's where we have all the communications when we do an audit. And having two places that talk about communications of audits could create a mess and could create different interpretations. And I don't think that that's exactly what we want to do. That would be my suggestion in any way.
Okay. I'm gonna pause. We're about halfway through reactions. Julie or Billy, would you like to come in?
Billy, I don't know if you want to come in on a couple of the points.
Yes, I can maybe add some responses to some of the issues that we've heard. I think I'm not going to try and cover all of them off. I think the broader transparency issues we've debated many times already. I think the point where we have arrived is what we think is doable in terms of recognizing that there's a lot of diversity on this issue. And in terms of trying to get to a balanced, flexible, and scalable approach, we have tried to be we've introduced a specific requirement that says a firm must have policies and procedures that address when communication to external parties are appropriate, and the matters and form of communication, and robust application material to support that. I think at previous board discussions we've heard from public members that if we were to require a blanket transparency report, it will be a fatal flaw for them. We are trying to reach a balance in this. In the ED, it was also not a requirement. It's still not a requirement, but we believe we have significantly enhanced the application material around that, and now elevated the communication to those charged with governance to a requirement. I think the other point is that whether the firm communicates independently, I think it's about, remember, the firm has to establish policies or procedures. So if the firm will direct through its policies or procedures how that communication will take place. Then the other point that I just wanted to comment on is I think Josephine made a very good point that, remember, this requirement and this standard applies beyond just audits. And although we're not setting a requirement for that, we do have the application materials that says you need to think about that maybe it is all appropriate in other engagements to do this communication. The construct that we've used in the application material is the same as the construct that is in ISA 260 when we talk about, in ISA 260, the part about auditor independence communication, exactly the same construct in terms of listed entities and application material to think about other entities. Obviously, in this case, we just had to align the application material to what we in any case have with the requirement on engagement quality review that is constructed in the same way. And that was the reason for what you see in the application material. Julie, those are all the points that I specifically wanted to maybe just come back on, but you're welcome to add to that.
No, that's very, very well covered. Thank you, Billy.
Thank you, Billy. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Julie, especially to, I'm a pedantic person, and I saw a question not answered, and it was bothering me for the last 2 days. So I'm glad you closed it off for me. Similar to Kai and Fernando, I do have a problem with this coming in here. To me, this is a proposed communication with those charged with governance of an audit of a listed company, and that to me sounds like this would be a conforming amendment to ISA 260 as written. I mean, we're talking about the audit of financial statements. So it seems unhelpful to me to put this audit communication, this one audit communication here in ISQM 1. Hasn't been exposed, and we're trying to change 260. So to me, there's due process questions that come up. I also wonder just whether we've really thought about all the impacts, since we're really thinking about only from a ISQM 1 lens. So let me back off. The actual requirement, if we were at a stage that we could change 260 through conforming amendment and not have any due process, I actually don't have a problem with it. I mean, the actual principle of what we're trying to say. I just have a problem with how we get there in the second to last, board meeting on trying to get this out, and it didn't go out in the ED. If on the actual wording in 41A DAI, I struggle with the connection into shall. So to me, I wonder it might be which shall require. That's if we stay with that language. That said, I'd prefer to break, if we stay with this, I prefer to break this into two elements. First, the when it would be appropriate, and second, the requirement to do it for the listed. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Len?
Thank you, Tom. I'm broadly supportive of the approach. I think we achieved the right balance, but I do have two comments for the task force to consider. Both comments are in application material A142. The first one is kind of minor, it's related to the second bullet. I think we should insert a word may in front of required. I think the way we draft the example, it shouldn't sound like a requirement. Certain jurisdictions do have that requirement for transparency report, but certain jurisdictions do not have that requirement. And the second comment is related to the third bullet. The third bullet, we are referencing to stock exchange rules and regulations. This is something new to ISAS or IFA handbook. We have never used the wording stock exchange rules and regulation, and this is the first time we have that mentioned. So just to be consistent with ISA 260, I think paragraph 7 and paragraph A6 in ISA 260 might have that specific language, how we describe communication with those in charge of governance. I think for the questions about this is based on ISA 260 language. I think that third bullet should be aligned with 260. So those are my two comments. But overall, I'm very supportive with where the task force has landed. Thank you.
Imran, I saw your hand emerge. I didn't know if it's a reaction to something specifically that was said, or could I take you after others' comment?
Thanks, Tom. It is in respect to what we've already heard. I've understood some objection to what is in the paper from at least some board members suggesting that this idea has not been exposed. And I appreciate that it may just be a question of interpretation, but my understanding of 41C4 in the ED had proposed this, but at a broader level. In fact, the application material in 41C4 in the ED had talked directly to those charged with governance. So in fact, what we're putting forward now, in my reading of it, seems to be something narrower than what was in the ED. And that's why perhaps the task force is not suggesting that this is a new requirement needing new exposure or anything of that sort. Thank you, Tom.
I have to say, Imran, when I hear some of those discussions, I come to share your view on the due process question. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been speaking about requirements on external reporting for the last, but as long as I've been on this board, and clearly it preceded. Otherwise, we would just have stuck with where the task force was a few months ago. So I understand that people will have different interpretations, but I find your point very compelling to me. Isabel.
Yes. The advantage of not going first is that you hear the comments on the others. So initially, I was about to say yes, and just add a drafting comment. But now I have 4 more comments to add. So I'm still at a yes and yes question. My drafting comment was to split the 41 big A, small d, big A, little I into 2, because that's true that the structure is quite strange. We start by when, we have then and shall, and then we have a when something else. So it's really strange, the connection of the parts of this requirement, because the first part is not really a requirement, it's a consideration, and then you have a requirement. Then my 4 comments. I was interested by the comment of Kai Hoover saying that whose chart with governance was not a very defined concept. But thinking about it, I think it does not apply here, because we are speaking about whose chart with governance of a listed entity. And normally in a listed entity, whose chart with governance is very formal and defined, and we have a lot of communication to do with them. So I don't see any issue with using the concept of whose chart with governance and communicate it to them, because it's in the context of an audit of a listed entity. My second point is that in Europe, in the European Union, we already prepare transparency report for audit firms auditing PI. So we already publish publicly transparency reports for the firms who are auditing PI. So I don't see any additional issue to communicate this transparency report to whose chart with governance, because it's already public. I was interested by my third point. I was interested by the suggestion to move the second part of little I to ISA 260, and I really think it's where it should be, because if we are dealing with the audit of listed entity, we should have that in an auditing standard more than in a standard that covers all the services. So I think it's something to consider. And last point, I want to react on what Imran said about public sector, because I thought it was interesting. But thinking, for example, at what has been done on the key audit matters, we are requesting key audit matters for listed, and we have not expanded that to public sector. But Intosai has done so, not by mandating, but by strongly recommending the use of key audit matters for the audit report in the public sector. So maybe if we don't do that, because we are not setting standards specifically for the public sector, Intosai may be in a position to do that for their member, as they already have done it for key audit matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Kai Martin.
Thank you. I'm supportive to the suggestions by the task force.
Okay, thank you. Bob Dorr.
Thanks, Tom, and I can be brief because I think Rich eloquently expressed the thoughts I have. I do believe that the communication requirements with those charged with governance should be in ISA 260. And if that's not the direction the board goes, then certainly the requirement here should be broken out into 2 for reasons that everybody else has stated about the construct. Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. Julie, very supportive of the direction here. I think this is a really great improvement. It's balanced and scalable. I think it's very helpful for those charged with governance to have this conversation with the auditors, and so I think it's proactive to be making this a requirement. I also recognize that in Canada we have a lot of smaller listed entities, and so the nature and extent of those communications will indeed vary from entity to entity. So I like the approach of not being too specific about the content. So I think from that point of view, it'll be great to see how this evolves in practice, and good practice evolves on that. I've heard the comments about whether it should or shouldn't be in 260. I I don't have strong views at this point, but I do agree that if it's retained here, I would support splitting out the requirement into A1. I heard the comments from Isabel and Imran about the public sector. You know, I was on two sides of the fence there, because on 153 FC, I thought it does have good application material around and possibly expanding the entities to whom this communication should go. So I'm not sure that it's needed, additional application material for the public sector, but I wouldn't object to that. And I also noted Len's concern about the third bullet in A142, and I kind of shared his views there that it's probably not, it may not be appropriate to include it there. But overall, I thought this was an excellent response to the comments that have been received. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Roger?
Thanks, Julie and Task Force. Look, as well as being scalable, like Eric has said, I think it's a very proportionate response for the issue that we're facing. So, so well done on that. I think they are the words for the week, as Josephine has said. I agree with the comments that if it stays here, and I think it should stay here, it should be separated out and highlighted a little bit. And you do need to have a look and then see if there is conforming amendments required for 260 as a result. So I would support that.
Thank you. Lynn?
Thank you very much. Over the time of this discussion, and I'm talking about the long term here, the years we've been talking about it, I think I've seen a sea change across people that they're generally accepting that some kind of reporting now is required, whereas 3 years ago, I think the opinion was a lot more divided. So I think this is a sensible way forward. I have 3 specific comments. I support the people talking about little d, big A of dividing out the when and the shall. I think it's confusing as it currently is. In terms of the public sector, I looked at my big audits and whether I would be able to fit within the standard if I was still auditing in the public sector. And I think a 153 FC does give that opportunity. If somebody wanted to specifically mention the public sector, that would be fine, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary, because starting with public accountability and public interest and public accountability automatically brings in the public sector and gives the hook that InterSci could use in producing their standards, which are based on ours. And finally, Vili's point from the discussions about the content of what this communication could include. I noticed nobody's really talked about it, and it doesn't fit nicely with principle-based standards. However, it's a good question, and I think it deserves a good answer, which I certainly haven't had time to think about, other than the fact that maybe we could talk about content in some of the implementation material. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rich?
Thanks, and sorry about coming back in, but there's something that you said, and actually something that Imran said. And I'm trying to do it off the cuff, but Imran referred to there being wording in the previous draft that was exposed that talked about, my paraphrase, those charged with governance. I did a quick read. I could not find that. To the point of transparency reporting, And should that go external or not? Of course, that's been what we've been talking about for the last, more than the last year, several years. But my issue is, again, this point is fine with me on its own. It's the question to me is bringing something in on those charges of governance, which is not in 260, but bringing it here. And that part I don't see. But again, if someone can point to me where it was in the exposure draft, even some sort of a loose linkage to those charges of governance, and maybe that might get me at least over the hurdle that there was some reference to it. But I didn't see it.
James, I see that you took your mic off mute. Were you trying to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to maybe just reset the discussion around placement in 260 versus ISQC 1. 260 is not a comprehensive standard that requires all communication requirements to sit within that standard. And you look to the appendix to that standard, there are requirements that are peppered throughout the ISAs themselves, and also even a reference from the extant ISA, ISQM1. So I actually believe the subject of communication, which is around QM, and a communication to those charged, it's not inconsistent with how the structure of the standards, the suite of standards, already exist today. So while there may be a preference and there are viewpoints on whether it's in ISA 260 or ISQCM1, I don't believe it's inconsistent with the structure of the standards for it to be presented in ISQM1. I just refer to the structure of 260 and extant QM1, extant ISQC1. So I just wanted to give a context that I don't believe we're breaching any protocols within the structure of the standards.
Thank you for that. I know task force members have been probably reluctant to speak before others joined in, but I certainly would welcome if ISQM1 task force members wanted to speak, to let them in, and any others who have not spoken yet on this topic. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. I think there's a couple of things that we should do here. I think let's separate a couple of the issues out. I think there's a question of whether there's broad support for the direction that the task force has suggested as it relates to a requirement for audit for those entities, for public listed entities, to have a communication with those charged with governance. I think that's the first order thing. And then there's questions about the language and the placement and the associated number of the specifics that have been raised. And, I'm not sure that we necessarily will resolve all of them today, but I think the biggest thing for the task force is to be getting clear guidance on the direction of this proposed requirement. Julie, does that make sense to you? Focus on that issue first.
It does, Tom, but I just, maybe before we go there, I think that a couple of board members have raised the due process question. I do think that we had in the ED a strong encouragement to communicate externally. I don't think we're inconsistent with what was in the exposure draft. We have moved this along, and I think that we've been responsive to a lot of commentary we got on the exposure draft. And so I just wanted to cover that off and address that particular point before we moved on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna need, by show of hands, about the concept that's being proposed here, recognizing that the words could adapt, and maybe about a requirement to communicate with those charged with governance for listed companies. Show hands who are supportive of that tact. I heard quite a bit of support. Okay. It's pretty overwhelming majority, but for the record, I'll say Eric, Imran, Chun-Li, Sachiko, Bob, Roger, Isabel, Kai, Len, Rich, Fernando, Fiona, Sue, Karen, Karen, obviously for the PIOB perspective, Lynn, and Julie, Josephine. So obviously there's a big support to continue to pursue this. There were, if you drop your hands, and like, I'm not sure we're gonna get a lot further than this today. There clearly was a desire for the board, for the task force to consider location issues and the interaction with 260. Some board members suggested that if you just break out the requirement in ISQM 1, that could be an approach forward. James tried to explain with some comfort some precedent related to that in our standards. But I think the task force has been really responsive here, but of course we've done this in quite a short period of time, that you may want to bring this issue back and consider this a little further. Would that make sense to everyone, and particularly you, Julie?
Sorry, Tom, just for clarity, what?
In terms of the interaction with placement of the requirement and how we deal with some of the suggestions related to 260.
Yes, I mean, we can certainly look at that. I think that what we're trying to set out here is the fact that the firm would need to have policies and procedures to require this to be communicated to those charged with governance in those particular circumstances. That could happen at the firm level, and that could happen through the engagement at the engagement team level. But that's essentially what we're setting out in ISQM 1. There is an interaction with 260 for sure, so we can take a look at that. But if we're in agreement that the firm would set out their policies and procedures to make this required communication, that's what we were hoping to get from the board in agreement.
Thank you. Any reactions to what Julie just described? Rich, I saw lots of thumbs up, but Rich has a hand up in the digital format. You're on mute, Rich.
Sorry, so as you were going for the task force to think about it, I would like them if they, even with the comments from that we talked about, that maybe this is not an exception to have it in one place and not the other, but is to consider whether we should do a conforming amendment then. So do it for the reasons that Julie just said of why you want to have something in ISQM 1, because you want the policy procedures, which I can understand, but it's still dealing with communications regarding an audit, and I think you really need to close that loop. At least have the task force consider it.
Now I'm on mute. Julie, I think you could take that back.
Yep, sure.
Okay. Any other issues that you want to raise, Julie, or need feedback on the topic?
No, Tommy, we've heard some comments around the application material, so sure, we can surely take that back. As you mentioned, it did come together a little bit just prior to the meeting, so there's certainly some refinements we can work on there.
Okay, thank you. Karen?
Yes, thanks, Tom. I wanted to just express my thanks for having this robust discussion, and for the majority to, I think, make this groundbreaking decision to have a requirement for external communication. And my suggestion is, if possible, Julie, maybe the next draft could come for the next phone call, I believe, in July. The timing is tight, I assume, but given the passionate comments, giving yourself more time before September, I think will be helpful for you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Karen. I think we even have a couple of opportunities between now and September to share drafts. Okay. Just looking down the list. Anything else that people feel needed to be raised, but they didn't have an opportunity to raise on this topic, or any others? Take a deep breath, everyone. You made it. At least made it to the top of the mountain for this week. Well, thank you. That really was a great discussion. I'm glad that people really bang on, stress test all the proposals, because again, we don't want to have unintended consequences when things look good on paper. So I really appreciate your willingness to come in with robust feedback on that topic and all the other topics this week. I look back at this week, and we've actually really, I think you sort of jokingly call it a quote unquote lighter meeting. I don't, as I said, I didn't think this was light at all. We've made clear progress on our direct path forward on LCEs and on audit evidence. We made real progress on finalizing the major issues on all the QM standards. We've talked about our approach to technology, which permeates almost everything that we do here. So not light at all. And I know you've spent lots of hours, sometimes at awkward times of the day too. So really appreciate that. I just wanted to give Jim and Karen the opportunity before we handle some administrative items to comment with any impressions. Jim?
Thanks, Tom. I don't have any additional thoughts to provide other than just reflecting on this week's meeting, and similar to what you said, that in this case, I think less was more. I thought we had better discussions with a more spaced out agenda. And so I think that would be something I would really like to see moving forward. In terms of CAG perspectives, I do think the CAG perspectives have been considered in the discussions and for the standards. So I was pleased with how it went from a CAG perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Jim, for your continued service to the CAG and to our organization's work. Karen?
Thanks, Tom. I echo Jim's comments. I'm very impressed with how well run this meeting is in a virtual format. Like you, I've been in several meetings over the last few months, and there's many jokes on the internet about virtual meetings, and none of those glitches happened. The technology worked almost seamlessly. Your focus on the key issues was excellent. And I really appreciate the robust discussion we had on the public interest issue of transparency reporting. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I take none of that credit. I think the credit rests with the staff team and the board members for the hard work and all the task forces. And sort of we're learning as we go along, but I think the board and the staff are proven to be adept learners in terms of this new Zoom world. So thank you, Karen and all, for your participation. A few items, unless anyone would like to share their observations. I pause for a second to see if anyone wants to share anything. Okay, well, as soon as June board meetings are over, we're looking forward to September, which will be a big one. A big one because we hope to approve the key quality management suite of standards, and also the less is more. Well, less in particular board sessions requires more days to get this done, so it's not so rushed. So it's a little spreading of time. I think people sense with 600's approval for an ED, that the tightness of the time frames made it chaotic when you had time zones and your work with your TAs. So we're talking to be spread out a little bit longer. So the board meeting for September will be held virtually, as people know, spread out through 7 sessions from September 14th to September 23rd. We're going to communicate the agenda. Draft agenda is pretty much set, but we'll communicate with the board members in due course. As they talk about opportunities, we do have 2 teleconferences, and I don't think the word teleconference is appropriate anymore. Zoom meetings scheduled for July 22nd and August 11th, and we'll confirm the topics of those calls shortly. It's probably near certain that we will have both of those calls, but obviously we'll confirm. We're going to have a CAG meeting September 8th through 9th, also via Zoom, and we'll be in short contact with task force chairs or work group chairs that need to join that as well. As you know, we endeavor to post papers early. I think the desire is to begin posting for September on August 24th. Some of you may still be at the beach, so a great beach reading. I assume not in Australia. It's a little cold for the beach at that time of year. And all the materials will be posted by August 28th. With that, I just thank you again for your attention. I also, the one group I haven't thanked, because we know how much they do as well, in addition to the board members and the staff or the TAs. So it's really important for us to acknowledge their continued efforts on our behalf, without which we would not proceed. So thank you all. Have a great rest of the day. Have a great weekend. You should be proud of your efforts in advancing the public interest this week. Speak to you later.